Welcome back to I Testify Conversation Station. We missed you. We missed you. If this is your first time as a viewer, welcome. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button down below. It's the red one. And don't forget to comment as we talk about our conversation this evening. I'm your host, Kherian Curtin, and we have a special guest today. His name is Pastor John Scott.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be here today, and I'm looking forward to this great conversation with Kherian.
Awesome.
Welcome to I Testify Conversation Station. Available on Spotify, Apple, Google podcast platforms.
I'm going to just give you a little intro of our guest today. He is born in Toronto, Canada, but he was raised in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes.
So he is an island boy.
The beautiful Twin Islands of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes. And just a bit about Pastor Scott. He currently serves as the Ontario Conference Youth Young Adult ACF Ministries Director. That was a mouthful.
Oh, that was a mouthful.
I got it in there. and this has been since of summer 2016. He's also serves as the SDA CC rep for the NAD, ACF, and Young Adult Advisors. Pastor Scott is a graduate of the Oakwood University, and that's in Huntsville, and also a graduate of the Andrews University as well. He has a BA in ministerial theology and is currently studying for a doctorate in ministry. Did I get that right?
Leadership.
So far?
Leadership,
awesome.
yes.
Okay.
Ministry leadership, yes.
Pastor Scott loves the Lord. He loves young people, and he's witnessed a lot in regards to the life-changing commitments of young people in regards to Christ. He likes to read. I love playing Scrabble and basketball, but most of all, what I thought was really inspiring is his motto, his gospel motto, where it says, "Not I, but Christ." So we're going to get into the discussion, the topic for today, and it's leadership. That's what it's about. We are going to be going into about 3 segments for today. The first is the call to leadership. What does that entail? The second is qualities of a good Christian leader. And then lastly, what does Jesus have to say about that? Jesus, the master worker. That's kind of where we're going to take this conversation for this evening. So let's start off first with the call to leadership. So how do you know that it's time to be a leader?
Very interesting question, and thanks so much for having me be part of this conversation today. I think it's a blessing to be able to talk about leadership generally, but also talk about leadership specifically as it relates to youth. I think one knows that they're called to leadership generally based on the demand for the moment. Just taking a step back, when you look at leadership, not everyone is called to leadership in every place. It certainly has to do with first as we would say, the demand of the moment or the demand of what's taking place. And so there may be an urgency for leadership to rise. And so when I think of leadership, I think of someone by the name of Gideon. He's one of my favorite characters, who I spoke about in some months ago, talking about the fact that here he was. He felt like he was least in his family, and his family was the least in their tribe. And yet the angel of God, who was God in that form, came to him and said, "Hey, you man of valor." And he came to him as a person who was treading wheat in a wine press, hiding away from the enemy who had surrounded them. And he was like, "Me? You talking to me?"
Listen.
He says, "Yeah, I'm talking to you. I mean, I could have gone to your cousins, I could have gone to your dad, but I didn't. I came specifically to you." There is that moment, that it's a crucial moment when that need, with that moment that is needed for a leader, and you will know, because it will be staring right at you. Now, you might not think that you have the qualities or the skills or the personality or whatever, but God has placed His hands on you to serve for that particular moment. And don't misunderstand the moment. If the moment is too small, He's probably not calling you for that. But if the moment is larger than yourself, He's calling you for it. But also, a couple of things that we ought to be to remember, even in this whole conversation of leadership, as the moment is big for you, or the assignment is big for you, we ought to know that this is not about you. That is actually about God, because ultimately God gets the glory. And I use some of these principles drawing from Gideon's life.
Yeah, Gideon. Man, that's when I think of that story, I'm with Gideon, because I would be like, huh? What? No, just a worshiper. I don't do anything. But yeah, no, that is amazing. So how do you accept God's call for leadership?
Well, you can do like Gideon, who exercised skepticism, who says, "Who me? No, that can't be so. I think you need to talk to somebody else." Who he exercised skepticism, which is a natural response for all of us, because sometimes we think that we just don't have adequate giftings to meet the demand for that moment, and so we exercise skepticism, and then we speak about our inadequacy, as he did. I'm the least in my tribe. I don't have the skills. Blah blah blah. But then there's a place where you get to the point where you say, "God, is this for me?" And this conversation has to do with the pulling, the tugging of faith, because you've expressed skepticism, which is a human response. You express inadequacy, which is also a human response. But then the divine and the human come together when that person says, "I'm about to exercise faith." So that person says, "Show me a sign." So Gideon says, "Show me a sign." This isn't to say that my answer is going to be yes. It simply says, I just need a little bit more time to think through this thing. You're doing this whole stall tactic. I need a little bit more time. Can you? How do I know it's you? And like Gideon, he made some food. When he brought it back, the angel of the Lord touched it with his hands, and it blew up in his face. That's when he knew that this was a God moment. And so that ushered him into a place of faithfulness. He realized that he was in a place where God was, where the divine and the human met. And that's when he began to worship.
So you're saying, like, if I want to be a leader, I need to say, "God, Uber me a Chick-fil-A." Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's what I need to do. And then I'll know for sure, like, this is you. This is you calling.
You can do that. You can do that as well. I mean, he went even beyond that, and he exercised obedience by knocking down his dad's altars and then building one in its place. But then he exercised some. He was at that place where he needed to make a decision that says, "Yes, I'm going to be this leader that you invited me to be, but I need to know that I'm going to be successful." And so he exercised an extra portion of his faith by saying, "Can you make the fleece wet and around it dry?" And the next day, the opposite, the fleece dry and the outside wet. And that was him confirming that indeed God had called him to it. Now, I'm just using Gideon as an example to suggest that there are different ways that there is one way that he calls you. And your call might be different from mine to leadership. But it also proves the point that God has multiple ways of calling different people. Think about people like Paul, for example, whose name had to be changed, who was a leader in and of himself. He was an intelligent man, etc., etc. But he had to come against a wall for him to recognize that his leadership qualities, or the good leadership qualities that he had, were not for what God intended. And so God had to turn his life around. But ultimately, God gives to us that moment when there is no doubt that this is where he wants us to be as leaders, and we have to either make our answer has to either be yes or no. And of course, he wants us to give a yes. And so, in answer, the narrow answer is we just simply, authentically, whether in the midst of skepticism and wonder and worry and am I the right person, he just simply wants our yes, because ultimately he's the one who gains the glory once we have assumed our assignment of leadership.
For sure, and it's always a very uncomfortable feeling, very, very uncomfortable feeling. But I love the point that you added, that at the end of the day, God is the one that gets the glory. And I think this is where our faith kicks in, right? That if we understand that God gets the glory, all he's asking us to do is to be available.
Absolutely.
Right? And then he, with his power and his might, executes, and through you, right, you're able to do things that you didn't even think that you were able to do, right? So I really, really like that. You alluded to,
and I'm glad that you mentioned it. Not to interrupt, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because the tools that we're given to work with, they defy human imagination. And understanding. That's probably better. Not just imagination, but understanding. Because you want me to do what with a staff, with a pitcher, or with a trumpet? What? It doesn't make sense. Yeah. Because the world says, well, you need a Lamborghini, or you need $1 million in your bank account, or you need several people working around you, and et cetera, which are good things if you do need those things as tools. But the tools that he gives to us, even if he calls us and we don't have tools, will defy human understanding.
For sure. It's just like what it says in Psalms 32, verse 8, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. Absolutely. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. I love David. He was just, man, I really know why God loved him, because he just really was just so authentic.
Absolutely.
When it came to understanding the power of God and that humbleness that an individual needs in order to really let God use you. You alluded earlier in regards to, and I'm paraphrasing here, that idea that, many are called but few are chosen, right? Does an individual voluntarily place themselves in a position of leadership, or do they sit and wait for that confirmation?
When we think about leadership, we think about what precedes it, servant leadership. Servant leadership is, I think, universal, because everyone who says that they're a child of God, they accept responsibility to be a disciple. And a disciple is one who leads automatically. You're being led, that's discipleship. You're being led by someone who's teaching you, and you're also leading others who are coming behind you. So it's a passing along of legacy. So that in and of itself, that's leadership taking place, whether you want to admit it or not. So every individual is called to be a servant leader. It's just the difference between those who actually do and those who don't it's pretty simple. Those who actually do versus those who actually don't. In other words, the one who says, yes, there is a problem, there is an issue, there is something that agitates the world, and it agitates me. And so I recognize that there is something that I can do. And so I get up and I go do it, rather than someone who says, well, I'm just going to watch movies all day long. I'm going to play Game Boy and whatever else, because those things don't agitate me. Racism doesn't agitate you. The plight of the world doesn't agitate you. Poverty doesn't agitate you. I think every person who says that they're a Christian ought to be agitated by something in the world that affects people. And so if you are a child of God, you're automatically a servant leader. And so you simply ought to rise up to do as you see the need is available. Now, of course, God may say to you, I'd like you to lead a number of those persons. And so he places you in perhaps a greater, or with a great, I don't want to say higher, but he gives you a greater level of responsibility to help lead others as they themselves lead.
So as you're alluding to, in the qualities of a good Christian leader, what would be the difference then, in your opinion, between a boss and a leader? You know what I mean? Because we can all say that we're bosses, but what's that difference? What's that underlining? What's that one thing that separates a boss from a leader?
Well, it's the difference between a command and demand. One is a demand of personality. One is the demand of the position, and the other one is a command of personality, or the purpose that is given to you to lead. So let me break it down. So one is elected to serve.
Okay.
Anybody could be elected. You can play the part of politics, and people can ask you to be the leader, right? And so, but just by virtue of that position, you are the leader. But there may be someone who, because of the demands of their personality and the purpose that is in their heart, people can definitely see that they are leaders, that they're going somewhere. One preacher once said, I like these kinds of lines. They say, anybody who says, follow me is going somewhere.
Mercy.
Right? And that's why Christ had such a powerful following. And the other teachers didn't. Or the other Pharisees and scribes, they didn't have the kind of following, and they felt a bit of a threat. They were elected to lead by virtue of, being from the tribe of so and so and so, and so they had leadership. But were people following them? No. Christ just called 12, started healing people, and by the demand of his personality and who he was, people started following. And people started coming with him and going wherever he went. You know those stories that says he went across the sea and boats. He went into one boat and several other boats were following him. Why? Because they just couldn't have enough of this demand for this personality. So people who were in position, they commanded it, and Christ, he demanded it because of his personality. So I think, in answer to the question, I think that would be the difference. One who's a boss is one who commands people. Sorry, the one who's a boss is one who demands it. But someone who is a leader commands it and offers a person or set of people a different way to solve a problem, to do a program, to change the world around them. So that's why I would call it the difference between a command and a demand.
Demand. So you touched on personalities. Can a person that's introverted, I'm going with this, can they be a leader? Because, there's some people that are introverted and they're kind of like, oh, can I be an effective leader? Like, is that personality, or that trait rather, is that a hindrance to the person being an effective leader?
When I think of some of the powerful leaders out there, many, if not most of them, were actually introvert. I think of Barack Obama, for example, or Abraham Lincoln. Many of them were introvert. They weren't extrovert, just defying conventional wisdom, because people assume that simply because you're an extrovert, then you have all these leadership qualities. But that might not be the case. An introvert is one who certainly can be leaders. I'm an introvert. Well, recently I discovered that I'm not just an introvert, but I'm also ambivert, because I have a bit of both. Okay. And in part because I've had to step out of my comfort zone of being one who spoke less and being more reflective and not being the limelight of the party. That's who introverts are. We have to go back home, go back into the cocoon and kind of refresh, recharge, and then come back out. Someone who's extrovert, they don't need any of that stuff. They just need to be around people. They gain their energy and their excitement from the energies of everyone else around them. They're like sponges, and they love that. They can go for 24 hours with a lot of people and enjoy that. For introverts,
it's tiring.
Truth
is, I'm tired. Options are few.
You got to. I'll come back.
Yeah.
I'll come back to you. Let me take a break. Let me take a break. Let me drink some water. Let me go freshen up.
Yeah.
And then come back out into the world and face the world. But I think extroverts can be just as excellent as leaders as introverts. I don't think the kind of personality traits that one has should be a hindrance.
So we talked about the different things that leaders need to do. What is the most, or not one of, what is the most, how does a leader know when to make a democratic decision? So they, gather everybody, or versus, an executive decision? Because we talk about being a leader. You mentioned that servant mentality, right? That it's not about self. And especially being a quality, especially being a Christian leader, we are reflecting Christ, right? So how do you balance that?
I think you'd have to, a person who's on their knees a lot will be given discernment. And I think before I could even answer that question, I think we need to define the qualities versus the characteristics. I think the characteristics speak to the tools of leadership, but I think the qualities speak to what's intrinsic. And I think a leader has to have certain internal intrinsic qualities that allows them, that gives them what they call gravitas, the grounding to lead. And I think a couple of things that come to mind when I think of those qualities would be humility, would be discernment, wisdom, those kinds of things. So when the moment calls for a leader to make a decision, because that leader has been a consensus builder anyway, they've been able to bring people together, have great conversations, listen to diverse thinking, etc. Those are all qualities as well. But there comes a point when the conversation is so straight and there's the ideas are so divergent, but there has to be a decision because something needs to be done to affect this issue or that issue. Because there's enough trust in that leader could say, okay, guys, gals, I've heard it all. You've made some really powerful points, but we really do need to feed the homeless today. And we've heard some points in terms of time, place, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what we need to do. Let's go do it, because ultimately it's not about us, and it's not about the comments that we're making around here. It's not about the giftings that we have around this room. It's about the homeless out there. So I think it's at that point when a leader can say, I'm making an executive decision today. And
it's cultivated because of that trust.
Right, because of those relationships that were built based on the foundation of trust.
All right, awesome. So for our viewers out there, we have young people that are, because they say young people are the future of the church. We're future leaders. A question popped into my mind as I thought about it is, how can I be an authentic leader? And I got stuff I'm struggling with as a Christian, right? Like everybody goes through their highs and lows with their spiritual walk. Not every day that you're 110%. How do you juggle that? Because it's a lot of pulling. It's a lot of pulling, right? And at times you may feel discouraged, or you feel like you're not worthy, or maybe you're battling with something, or maybe you're battling with a temptation. Like what would you say to a young leader in regards to that?
That's a tough one. And it's hard to quantify in terms of how you answer a question like that, because I think often our we get in our own way. When
Get in our own heads.
yeah, we get in our
Yeah.
own heads, and especially just going back to the whole question of the introvert, they live a lot in their head, and so they spend a lot of time thinking, okay, the last time that I did this, it didn't go well. When I sang, when I preached, and they can list down and be so burdensome against themselves, and folk around there like, bro, it's not that big of a deal.
I know, right?
And I've done that to myself multiple times. And so,
Yes.
I'm testifying. I testify,
Let the Lord use you. Let him use you.
and you know that you fumbled and messed up and you're so hard on yourselves,
Yes.
on yourself, that you don't know if you'll do well this next time. But you have to sort of put yourself behind, because leadership calls us to step outside of ourselves and to step outside of our own comfort zone, especially as it relates to relieving the suffering of humanity and helping humanity in a way that is meaningful for them. You have to sort of step out of your own self, out of your head, out of your story, out of your, what you would say is your past, and kind of take a view of what is to come, what's in the future. And it's at that tug of war, if you want to use that phrase again, it's at that tug of war that you realize, okay, because the assignment is much bigger than myself, much bigger than my personality, much bigger than my mistakes, much bigger than my past, much bigger than what I wasn't able to accomplish yesterday or yesteryear or last month. That's not important. That's behind me. I have to have the can do, and I'm going to press forward attitude to the moment of leadership. When that moment is called for you to serve in that role, you have to take the perspective of, okay, I'm going to have to think less of what's happened in the past and think more about what's yet to come. And I think Paul gets to that place in his life where he felt that even though he was at the end of his road, he says, I'm still pressing. I mean, we're talking about a guy who was in jail.
The
He was in
upward
a
way.
dungeon. His feet were clasped, his hands the same. He was stocked in a dungeon, in a jail. And he says, we would say that he was facetious, but
Crazy.
crazy even. But here's a man who says, despite what happened in my past and despite the fact that I'm about to meet my end, it doesn't matter. I'm still pressing because there's so much more that I have to accomplish for God. There's so much that I have to finish, that I have to do. He says, I have not apprehended yet. So leaders of today, and I don't call youth leaders of tomorrow. I call them youth and leaders of today, because God can use any person to be a leader, whether they're 5 years old, 10, 15, 20, 25, doesn't matter. Whatever age that he calls you to serve in that role as a leader, as a servant leader, that's when you serve. So you have to sort of put aside what has happened in your past, put aside maybe a hurt that you're experiencing. And that isn't to say that you have to be inauthentic. It just says that what happened to you in your past is not as important as to what's going to happen in your future.
Amen. And we, for our final point, in understanding and discussing about leadership, what is God's formula for success, right? We touched on it in regards to the discernment and understanding the attacks of the enemy, because that's going to come. And we need to be on our knees, as you alluded, if we're going to really have that servant mentality when it comes to leadership. What would be your final, affirmation? Let's call it that, affirmation for somebody who God is bugging at them, saying, listen, I've called you to do this. I need you to do this. And they're feeling like, listen, I'm not it, Lord. I am not it, just like Gideon. What would be your statement? What would you let them know?
I would say, take every opportunity to reduce your fear. You know, as the some preachers have said, you know, the fear is the dark room where the enemy wants to develop our negatives.
Mercy.
You know, I always thought
That's a lot.
It does a lot. You know, reduce your fears, because fear speaks to your humanity, yes, but also fear speaks to who's calling you and your fears. But faith speaks to who's calling you to do something bigger than yourself. Right. So they're two different people. One is the enemy, and the other one is Christ and heaven. You know, there's no middle road, unfortunately, for those who seek a middle road. You know, being on the fence. Of course, nothing ever gets done while you're on the fence. You have to take a side. But I would say, find every opportunity to decrease your fears and increase your faith, because that's when God can truly use you. And remember that God ultimately gains control. That God is in control of it, but He also gains the glory. He also gains the glory. So for any young person who desires leadership, any young person who didn't think that they were called, and didn't realize before today that they are indeed called to be a leader, including yourself, Kherian.
I'm pointing to myself, guys. I'm pointing to myself.
Yeah, God has definitely placed calling on your life. And any young person out there, He's placed a calling on their life as well. And despite the fact that we might not know exactly where He's leading,
Right.
It's you know, it's going to be dim, very cloudy. You know, we won't know the end from the beginning. That's okay. He does. You know, He's the great I am. And you're just a dot on the easel of eternity.
A whole dot.
Just a dot.
A whole dot.
Because He sees the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And you are an important, a significant part of that picture.
Awesome.
And He calls you, and He wants and desires to use you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Well, you've heard it. Okay, if you want to be a leader, if God is nudging you, you got to get on your knees. You got to talk to Him, right? Have a relationship with God and say, God, what is it that you want from me? Because at the end of the day, He's the one that gets the glory. He's the one that gets the honor. I want to thank Pastor John Scott for being with us and just having this dialogue about leadership, what it means to be a leader. The good qualities of being a Christian leader, and understanding that at the end of the day, even if you don't feel worthy, even if you think that you may not have the tools, know that God is just asking you to be willing. That's it. He's just asking you to be willing, and He does the rest, right? As long as we have the faith, He has the power. It becomes a whole meal. So again, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, comment them down below. And thank you so much for joining I Testify Conversation Station.
This is I Testify, and you're listening to the Conversation Station.
Available on all podcast platforms.